Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the choked darkness of Victorian London, into a world where children, as young as 5, were sold to climb chimneys barely wider than their small, malnourished bodies. This isn't a story about heroes or adventure. It's about survival, suffering, and a childhood stolen by industrial progress. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into forgotten histories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our global audience. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's descend together into the life of a Victorian climbing boy. Congratulations. You're born into soot. You didn't enter the world with promise or privilege, just timing, and the timing is terrible. It's 1832, maybe 1840, maybe earlier. The year doesn't matter much when you're born poor in London, Manchester, or any of the smoke-choked cities crawling across England's industrial face. Your mother, if she survives the birth, holds you for perhaps a day, maybe a week, before the arithmetic of poverty does its cruel work. Too many mouths. Not enough bread. A baby is a liability wrapped in rags, and you, small and squirming, are just another expense in a ledger already written in red. The room you're born into smells like damp stone, rotting wood, and desperation. There's no midwife, just a neighbor woman who's seen too many births go wrong. Your first breath tastes like coal smoke drifting through broken windows. Your first sound is a cry that no one has time to comfort. Outside, the city clangs and hisses, with the sound of an empire building itself on the backs of people who will never see its profits. You are born in the shadow of chimneys, thousands of them, brick towers exhaling darkness into skies already grey with progress. Your father, if he's present at all, works 18-hour days in a factory, a mill, or the docks. His wages barely cover the gin he needs to forget his wages. Your mother takes in washing, or sewing, or whatever piecework she can manage between caring for children she can't afford to feed. You have siblings, probably, though some have already died from diseases with names no one in your street can pronounce. Cholera, typhus, hunger. By the time you're 3, you're walking, talking, and costing money. You're not yet useful, which makes you dangerous to a family operating on the thinnest margins of survival. Other children your age play with whatever they can find: barrel hoops, bent nails, rats if they're quick enough. You don't play much. Play requires energy, and energy requires food, and food is the thing that's always running out. Your clothes, if you can call them that, are layers of fabric too worn to identify their original purpose. A shirt that might have been your brother's. Trousers held up with rope. No shoes, because shoes are luxuries for children with futures. Your feet develop calluses thick as leather before you turn 4. You learn to avoid broken glass, hot coals spilled in the street, and the hooves of horses pulling carts driven by men who won't slow down for gutter children. The world is loud and enormous and indifferent. Buildings rise like cliffs on either side of narrow streets that never see full sunlight. The air tastes metallic, sooty, wrong. Everyone moves fast, pursuing something or fleeing something else. You learn early that standing still gets you trampled, and crying gets you nothing but a cuff to the head. By the age of 4, you're expected to contribute. Not in the way children contribute in picture books, with cheerful helpfulness and rosy cheeks, but in the grim mathematics of survival. You run errands for a penny. You hold horses for gentlemen who don't look at your face. You pick through refuse heaps looking for rags, bones, anything that can be sold to the rag and bone man who haunts your street like a spectre. And then one day, a man appears. He's not a gentleman, but he's not from your street either. He wears a coat that's seen better years, but still has most of its buttons. His face is dark, not with dirt exactly, but with something that's become part of his skin, a permanent shadow. He smells like old fires and brick dust. He walks with your father to the corner, where they talk in voices too low to hear, but easy enough to understand. Money changes hands. Not much. Enough. Your father returns and tells you you're going to learn a trade. He doesn't meet your eyes when he says it. Your mother turns her face to the wall. Your siblings, the ones young enough not to understand, stare at you with empty expressions. The older ones know. They look relieved it's not them. The man, your new master, tells you his name is Mr. Grimes, or Mr. Webb, or Mr. Black. The name doesn't matter. You'll never use it to his face anyway. He looks you over like you're a horse at market, checking your size, your limbs, your pliability. He asks your age. Your father lies, says you're 6 when you're barely 5, because 6 sounds more capable, more ready, more worth the 3 shillings he's just been paid. Mr. Grimes nods and puts a hand on your shoulder. It's not a comforting gesture. It's ownership. You belong to him now, for 7 years, or until you're too big to fit in chimneys, or until you die. Whichever comes first. You leave that day. No ceremony, no farewell. Just a transaction completed. Your mother doesn't hug you. Your father doesn't look back. You walk behind Mr. Grimes through streets that grow unfamiliar, away from the only corner of London you've ever known, toward a future that smells like burning. He takes you to his lodgings, a basement room in a sagging building near Covent Garden. It's dark even in daytime, lit by a single candle stub when you're lucky, not lit at all most nights. There are other boys here, 3 of them, ranging from maybe 6 to 10 years old. They're thin as sticks and black as coal, covered in soot from hairline to toenails. They look at you without curiosity, without sympathy. Just the blank recognition of someone who's joined their ranks. Mr. Grimes doesn't waste time with introductions or explanations. He tells you to strip. You don't understand, so he yanks your shirt over your head himself and throws it in a corner. Your trousers follow. You stand naked and shivering in the basement damp, skinny ribs visible, knees knobby, everything about you announcing your malnutrition and vulnerability. One of the other boys brings a bucket of something dark and oily. Mr. Grimes takes a rag, dunks it, and begins smearing your skin. It's brine. Salt water mixed with something astringent that makes your skin burn and tingle. He works methodically, covering your arms, your legs, your back, your chest. He doesn't explain, but the other boys watch with expressions that might be pity if they had energy for emotions beyond survival. The brine is supposed to harden your skin, toughen it up for what's coming. It doesn't work, not really, but master sweeps believe it does, so they do it anyway. After you're coated, you're given a sack to sleep on in the corner with the other boys. No blanket. The basement is cold enough that you can see your breath, but the other boys huddle together for warmth, and eventually, you learn to do the same. You don't sleep much that first night. The soot-stained boys wheeze in their sleep, wet, rattling sounds that will become familiar. The room smells like old smoke and unwashed bodies, and something sweet, sick you can't identify yet, but will later recognize as infection. Outside, the city continues its endless noise, cartwheels on cobblestones, shouting, a woman's scream that might be laughter or terror. You don't know which. You don't know anything. Before dawn, Mr. Grimes kicks the pile of boys awake. There's no breakfast, just a cup of water so cold it hurts your teeth, and a chunk of bread so stale you have to suck it soft enough to chew. The other boys eat mechanically, without pleasure. Fuel more than food. You try to copy them. Then Mr. Grimes hands you a brush, a long pole with stiff bristles at the end, and a burlap sack. He tells you to follow, and you do, trailing behind as he leads the group through pre-dawn streets toward the better parts of London, where the houses are tall and made of clean stone, where the chimneys rise like forests of brick. Your first chimney is in a house in Bloomsbury, a respectable address with a black iron fence and a brass knocker. Mr. Grimes knocks at the servant's entrance, exchanges words with a housemaid, who looks at you boys like you're a necessary evil, and you're led through to the kitchen. The hearth is enormous, the fireplace wide enough that you could stand in it if you were braver. But you're not here for the fireplace. You're here for what's above it. Mr. Grimes points at the chimney opening, a dark square more in the brick wall, and tells you to climb. Just like that. No training, no preparation. No explanation of what to do or how to do it. Just climb, clean it, come down. You stare at the opening. It's barely 2 feet by 2 feet, maybe smaller. The brick stained black and radiating a heat that means the fire was burning just hours ago. The other boys have already scattered to other parts of the house, other chimneys. Their duties assigned with the efficiency of long practice. You're alone with Mr. Grimes and the dark hole and your own thundering heartbeat. When you don't move fast enough, Mr. Grimes grabs you by the back of the neck and shoves you forward. Your hands catch on the warm bricks, and then he's lifting you, pushing you into the opening, folding your body into the shaft like your cargo. The space is impossibly tight. Your shoulders scrape the sides. Your knees bang against brick. The darkness is total, absolute, the kind of darkness that makes you forget light exists. And then you're inside, wedged in the flue, and there's no room to turn around, no room to do anything but go up or come back down. Mr. Grimes shouts from below, telling you to climb, to use your knees and elbows, to brace yourself against the sides and push. His voice echoes weirdly in the shaft, bouncing off brick, distorting into something inhuman. You try to move. Your foot slips on the sooty brick. Your knee finds purchase, then loses it. The shaft is maybe 2 feet wide, sometimes less, and your body barely fits. You can't extend your arms fully, can't straighten your legs, can only wiggle and wedge and scrape your way upward inch by inch. The bricks tear at your skin, catching on your elbows, your knees, your shoulders. The soot is everywhere, in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, thick and choking, and tasting like bitter charcoal. You climb because there's no other option. Down means Mr. Grimes and his anger, and possibly worse things you don't have names for yet. Up means maybe, eventually, sky. You wedge your back against one wall, your feet against the other, and push. Inch by inch, the skin on your knees opens up, leaving wet streaks on the brick. Your elbows do the same. The soot gets in the wounds immediately, black and stinging. The shaft angles. Most chimneys aren't straight, they bend, they turn. They narrow and widen unpredictably based on the whims of Victorian architecture and the spaces they had to work around. You reach a bend and have to contort, folding yourself nearly in half to navigate the turn. Your spine protests. Your hips scream. You've never bent this way before, never had to compress your body into shapes this unnatural. And then you're stuck. It happens so suddenly you don't realize it at first. You push upward and nothing happens. You try to pull back and can't. Your body is wedged in the narrowest part of the bend, caught between 2 walls of brick, unable to move forward or backward. Panic hits like ice water. You try to scream, but can't fill your lungs enough for sound. You thrash, and that makes it worse, wedging you tighter, scraping more skin off your body, filling the tiny space with even more of you. From below, impossibly distant, you hear Mr. Grimes shouting. You can't make out the words, just the anger in them. You're taking too long. You're costing him time and therefore money. You need to move. You can't move. Your chest is compressed, crushed between brick walls, and you can only take the shallowest breaths, little sips of sooty air that make you cough. And coughing makes your chest expand, which makes the wedging worse. You taste blood in your mouth from somewhere, maybe bit your tongue. Maybe your gums are bleeding from the soot and lack of water. Your vision, already useless in the dark, starts to sparkle and fade. You're 5 years old and dying in a chimney in Bloomsbury, and no one will know or care except that Mr. Grimes will be annoyed about losing his investment. Then something changes. Maybe your desperate wiggling shifted something. Maybe your body compressed just enough. Maybe God or luck or random chance intervenes. You move. Just an inch, but it's an inch in the right direction. You push again, ignoring the pain, ignoring the tearing skin, ignoring everything except the need to move. Another inch. Another. You're through the bend. The shaft widens slightly, and you can almost breathe normally, almost move your arms. You continue climbing, faster now, terrified of getting stuck again. Terrified of the dark and the tight, and the brick walls that seem alive with malice. Your hands find the brush Mr. Grimes shoved up ahead of you. And you remember you're supposed to be cleaning, not just climbing. You scrape the brush against the walls as you climb, dislodging decades of built-up soot and creosote. It falls down past you, a black rain that coats you further, gets in your eyes, your ears, your mouth. You're crying now, hot tears cutting tracks through the soot on your face, but you don't stop, can't stop. After an eternity, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, your hand breaks through into open air. You've reached the top, the chimney pot, the opening to the sky. You pull yourself up and out, emerging onto the roof of the Bloomsbury house like a demon born from brick and soot. The morning air is cold and clean, and so shockingly fresh you start coughing, your lungs trying to expel the filth you've been breathing. The sun is rising, pale and weak through London's perpetual haze. But it's light, real light, and you've never been so grateful for anything. You're covered head to toe in black soot, naked except for the thin undershorts Mr. Grimes gave you, bleeding from a dozen places, shaking with exhaustion and terror and cold. Below, very far below, you hear Mr. Grimes shouting for you to come down. You've cleaned one chimney. There are 4 more in this house, and after this house, there are 6 more houses on his list for today. You climb back down into the dark. The descent is worse than the climb, because gravity wants to help, wants to send you sliding and scraping, and falling down the shaft. You have to go slowly, carefully, bracing yourself against the walls with arms and legs that are already shaking with fatigue. The soot you dislodged on the way up has settled on every surface, making the bricks even more slippery. Your blood makes it worse, leaving sticky patches that catch and then slip at the worst moments. When you finally emerge at the bottom, dropping out of the fireplace into the kitchen, the housemaid gasps and steps back. You must look like something from a nightmare, a small demon made of soot and blood and smoke. Mr. Grimes just grunts and points at the next chimney. You do 5 chimneys in that house. By the 3rd, your body is moving on autopilot, beyond pain, beyond thought. By the 5th, you're not sure if you're awake or dreaming or dead. The other boys finish their chimneys and wait, black statues in the kitchen, their eyes the only bright things about them, white standing out against the soot. Then you move to the next house, and the next. By noon, you've climbed 12 chimneys. Your hands don't look like hands anymore, just raw meat wrapped around bones. Your knees are the same. Every part of you that touched brick is bleeding or bruised or both. The soot has gotten into all the wounds, creating a black crust that cracks when you move. Mr. Grimes gives you no food, just water from a pump in an alley, and even that seems like a luxury. The water runs black when you splash it on your face, carrying away the top layer of soot, but unable to reach the grime that's already soaking into your pores, becoming part of you. By evening, you've done 20 chimneys, maybe 25. You've lost count. Your body is a collection of pains so comprehensive they blur into white noise. You're not crying anymore, because you don't have the water to spare for tears. You're not thinking anymore, because thought requires energy, and you have none. When Mr. Grimes finally leads you back to the basement, you collapse on your sack and don't move. One of the other boys, the oldest one, brings you a piece of bread. You're too exhausted to eat it. He leaves it near your face, and eventually, sometime in the night, you wake up enough to gnaw on it, your jaw moving mechanically, swallowing without tasting. This is your first day as a climbing boy, a chimney sweep, a child labourer in the most brutal trade Victorian England has to offer. You have 7 years of this ahead of you, assuming you survive. Most don't. The industry exists because of simple economics and physics. Chimneys need cleaning or they catch fire, filling houses with smoke and flames, burning down the investments of the wealthy and the respectable. But chimneys in Georgian and Victorian houses are narrow, winding, sometimes barely 18 inches square, designed to maximize heat efficiency and minimize building materials, not cleaned with any concern for the humans who would have to maintain them. adults can't fit. Even small adults, even women, can't contort themselves through the tight bends and narrow flues that characterize British domestic architecture. But children can, especially small, malnourished children who can compress their bodies into spaces that seem impossible, who can be trained through necessity and violence to overcome every natural instinct screaming at them not to enter the dark. So the trade uses children, has always used children, will continue using children for decades more. It's legal. It's accepted. It's necessary, or so everyone tells themselves. The alternative, keeping chimneys clean without child labour, would require rebuilding every chimney in every house in England, or developing mechanical sweeping devices that don't exist yet, or admitting that maybe, possibly, some aspects of progress come with costs too high to pay. No one wants to pay those costs, so children pay instead. You learn the rhythm quickly because you have no choice. Mr. Grimes wakes you before dawn, every dawn, except Sundays, and even then he sometimes has emergency calls from wealthy clients whose chimneys have caught fire and need immediate attention. You drink water. You eat a piece of bread if you're lucky, nothing if you're not. Then you walk, or run, through London's streets to wherever the work is waiting. The wealthy neighbourhoods, Mayfair, Belgravia, Bloomsbury, have the most chimneys and the most money. Mr. Grimes charges 6p per chimney there, sometimes more. In poorer areas, he charges less, but there's less work because people let their chimneys go uncleaned until they catch fire, then sweep them out themselves with whatever they have. Your work, therefore, takes you into the homes of the comfortable classes, the merchants and lawyers and minor nobility who can afford regular maintenance. You enter through servants' entrances, always. You track soot through their clean kitchens. You climb their flues while they sleep or eat breakfast, or ignore your existence. To them, you're not a child. You're a service, a necessary unpleasantness, like the night soil men or the rat catchers. They don't want to look at you, don't want to acknowledge what you represent. Some houses have multiple chimneys, 5, 8, 12 flues that all need cleaning. You do them systematically, working from bottom to top when possible, trying to minimize the soot fall. It's impossible to be completely clean about it. Soot gets everywhere, dusting the hearths, the mantels, the carpets. The housemaids hate you for it, hate the extra work you create, hate what you represent. They never offer kindness, just pointed glares and muttered complaints. The chimneys themselves are all different. Some are straight shots, 15 or 20 feet of relatively easy climbing. These are the good ones, the chimneys you pray for. Others are mazes, turning at odd angles, narrowing and widening unpredictably, sometimes splitting into multiple flues that you have to navigate blind. These are the nightmares. Some chimneys still have hot soot from the morning fire. You learn to recognize the heat before you enter. Learn to judge whether it's hot enough to burn or just hot enough to hurt. You climb the hot ones anyway, because Mr. Grimes doesn't accept excuses. The soles of your feet develop thick calluses that can withstand temperatures that would blister normal skin. Your hands do the same. You become less human, more tool. The worst chimneys are the ones that haven't been cleaned in years, where the creosote has built up into thick, tarry layers that you have to scrape off with your bare hands, your fingernails, sometimes your teeth. The creosote is toxic, carcinogenic, but no one knows this yet or cares if they do. You breathe it, eat it, absorb it through your skin. It will kill you eventually, but eventually is years away, and right now you're just trying to survive today. You get stuck regularly. Everyone does. Sometimes you can work yourself free, using the techniques the other boys have taught you, wiggling and twisting and ignoring the pain as brick strips flesh. Sometimes you can't, and then you scream for Mr. Grimes, and he has options, none of them pleasant. Sometimes he lights a small fire at the base of the chimney, creating smoke and heat that force you to climb higher, faster. Overcome your stuck position through sheer terror and the animal need to escape burning. Sometimes he sends another, smaller boy up behind you to push it, using a human battering ram to force you through the narrow spot. Sometimes, if you're really stuck and time is running out, he climbs up himself as far as he can and uses a long pole to prod you, jab you, hurt you until you move. You learn not to get stuck. You learn to compress your body in ways that seem impossible, dislocating your shoulders when necessary, folding yourself into shapes no spine should make. You learn because the alternative is suffocation, burning or beating, and any of those will end you. The other boys in Mr. Grimes's employ are not your friends, exactly, but they're your only companions. There's Thomas, who's 9, and has been sweeping for 4 years, his lungs already making wet sounds that mean he won't see 10. There's William, who's 7 and still sometimes cries at night, though quietly, because crying loud enough for Mr. Grimes to hear earns a beating. There's Jack, who's 6 but tells everyone he's 8, as if lying about his age might somehow make him big enough to escape. You don't play together, don't laugh together, don't do any of the things children are supposed to do. You're too tired, too hungry, too broken, but you huddle together for warmth at night. And sometimes Thomas will tell you which chimneys are the worst, which houses have mean servants who throw things at climbing boys, which corners of London have constables who don't move you along as quickly. This is the extent of your social life. Mr. Grimes feeds you enough to keep you alive, barely. Bread mostly, stale and cheap. Sometimes porridge, so thin you can see the bottom of the bowl through it. Once a week, if he's feeling generous, or has had a good take, there might be a piece of bacon fat, or a potato. You eat things you find in the street. Apple cores that still have a bit of flesh, crusts thrown out by bakers, once a dead pigeon that William swore was still good. You cook it over a candle flame and eat it without seasoning, without joy, just protein and survival. Your body reflects the malnutrition. You grow, but slowly, and wrong. Your legs bow slightly from rickets. Your teeth ache and sometimes fall out from scurvy. Your stomach is always distended, full of gas and hunger, and nothing substantial. Your ribs are visible, and your shoulder blades stick out like wings. You look like every other climbing boy in London. Like poverty has a uniform, and you're all wearing it. The work destroys you incrementally. Each climb takes a little more skin, a little more strength, a little more of whatever made you human. Your knees become permanent wounds, raw sores that never heal because you never stop climbing long enough for them to close. They weep constantly, mixing blood and pus with soot into a paste that hardens overnight and has to be cracked open each morning when you move. Your elbows are the same, matching wounds on both arms, the skin scraped away down to something that might be bone or tendon. You can't tell anymore. You wrap them in rags sometimes, but the rags just collect soot and make the infection worse. So mostly you leave them bare, black and red and glistening. Your back is one long bruise from the constant scraping against brick. The vertebrae of your spine, each one, has its own area of damaged skin, creating a railroad track of wounds down your back. Sleeping on your back is impossible, but sleeping on your front presses your knees into the floor. So you learn to sleep on your side, curled into a position that minimizes contact with anything. Your feet, which started with soft child's skin, become something else entirely, crusted and cracked and black. You can walk on broken glass without noticing. You can stand on hot coals for short periods. This isn't strength or resilience, just damage normalized, nerves so traumatized they've stopped reporting pain effectively. The soot is everywhere, in everything. It's in your hair, which you haven't washed in weeks, creating a matted cap of black filth. It's in your ears, your nostrils, your mouth. You taste it constantly, a bitter, acrid flavor that defines your existence. You cough it up in black phlegm, thick and chunky with particles that look like bits of coal. Your snot runs black. Your tears, when you cry, leave black tracks. It gets in your lungs most of all. Each breath carries soot particles deep into your respiratory system, coating the delicate tissues, settling into alveoli, beginning the long process of destruction that will eventually kill you. You don't know this yet. Don't understand why you're starting to wheeze like Thomas, why climbing stairs makes you breathless, why there's a tightness in your chest that never goes away. You're 6 years old and developing chimney sweeps cancer, miner's lung, a dozen conditions that won't be fully understood for decades. Your clothes, what few you have, are rags. The thin shirt you started with has torn in so many places, it's more holes than fabric. Your trousers, held up with rope, are stiff with dried soot and blood, crusted into something like armor. You don't own shoes. Shoes would just fill with soot and make climbing harder. Your feet, bare and hardened, are tools, not body parts. Mr. Grimes provides nothing beyond the minimum necessary to keep you functional. No soap. No clean water beyond what you can steal from public pumps. No medicine, no comfort. When you're injured beyond ability to work, he leaves you in the basement to heal or die, whichever comes first. If you die, he'll buy another boy to replace you. The workhouses and slums of London produce an endless supply of desperate children, whose parents will sell them for a few shillings and the promise they're learning a trade. You see other climbing boys in your travels through London. They're everywhere, small black figures emerging from chimneys across the city, crawling on rooftops, running through streets behind their masters. Some are worse off than you, even smaller, even more damaged. Some are marginally better, working for masters who at least feed them regularly. You don't speak to them, don't acknowledge them. There's an understanding that you're all in competition for the same work, the same survival, and solidarity is a luxury none of you can afford. The work is dangerous beyond the obvious ways. Beyond getting stuck, beyond the burns and scrapes and cuts, there are falls. Roofs in Victorian London are steep, slippery with moss and bird droppings, and you're often working on them in the early morning when frost makes everything treacherous. Boys fall regularly. Sometimes they die. Sometimes they live but break bones that never heal properly, leaving them twisted and even less useful than before. There are fires. Sometimes you enter a chimney that seems cold, but has embers still glowing deep in the soot. The heat hits you halfway up, and then you have to decide, continue and burn or retreat and face Mr. Grimes's anger. Most boys continue. You get burned. Your hair sings off. Your skin blisters. But you don't die. Not today, so you keep climbing. There are suffocations. If you get stuck in a narrow flue and panic, you breathe too fast. Use up the limited oxygen available and pass out. If you're lucky, you slump in a position that lets you slide back down. If you're not, you die there, wedged in the dark, and have to be extracted in pieces days later when someone notices the smell. There are assaults. Some homeowners, some servants, view climbing boys as less than human, as appropriate targets for their frustrations and cruelties. You're slapped, kicked, shoved. Once, a butler throws a kettle of hot water at you because you tracked soot on a clean floor. The water hits your back, adding burns to your collection of injuries. You don't cry out because crying makes it worse. Mr. Grimes himself is a source of constant violence. He beats you regularly, not out of rage exactly, but as a management technique. You're too slow, you get hit. You track too much soot, you get hit. You ask for food, you get hit. The beatings are methodical, calculated to hurt but not disable. To remind you of your place without rendering you unable to work. He uses his hands, his boots, his belt, whatever's convenient. He aims for areas that hurt but don't show: your back, your sides, your thighs. Your face is usually spared because customers don't like looking at obviously beaten children. It reminds them of what they're participating in. The rest of you is fair game. The other boys receive the same treatment. You watch William get beaten for crying. Watch Thomas get beaten for coughing too loud. Watch Jack get beaten for asking when he can see his mother. You learn to be silent, to be fast, to be invisible except when Mr. Grimes needs you visible. Once you try to run. It's your 3rd month in the trade. And you've finally mapped enough of London to think you might be able to navigate back to your old street. Back to your family. Back to anything that isn't this. You wait until Mr. Grimes is drunk, which is most nights, and slip out of the basement into the dark. You run through streets you half recognize, heading towards Seven Dials, toward the rookery where you were born. Your bare feet slap on cobblestones. Your breath comes in wheezes. You're weak from malnutrition and injury, but you run anyway, because hope is a powerful drug, even when it's delusional. You make it maybe half a mile before Mr. Grimes catches you. He's not as drunk as you thought, and he knows these streets better than you do. He grabs you by the hair and drags you back to the basement, and then he beats you with his belt, until you can't stand. Until your back is striped with welts, until you've learned the lesson he's teaching, which is that you belong to him, that escape is impossible, that hope is dangerous. After that, you don't try again. Neither do the other boys. You're all too broken, too tired, too convinced of your own helplessness. Mr. Grimes has won, not through kindness or loyalty, but through the systematic destruction of your will to resist. Sundays are different, but not better. Mr. Grimes doesn't usually work Sundays, respecting Victorian propriety, even if he respects nothing else. But he doesn't let you rest either. You spend Sundays begging. He sends you out to wealthy neighborhoods, to church gates, to anywhere well-dressed people might be passing. And you stand there with your suit, stained face, and your visible injuries, and your tiny, broken body. And you hold out your hand. Some people give you coins, pennies mostly, sometimes threepence, if they're feeling particularly Christian after church. Most walk past without looking. You're not the only beggar, not even the only child beggar, and compassion fatigue is epidemic in Victorian London. There are too many poor, too many suffering, too many problems that seem too large to solve, so people solve none of them and ease their consciences with the occasional coin. Any money you collect goes to Mr. Grimes. All of it. If he suspects you're holding back, he searches you, and if he finds anything, the beating that follows makes his usual violence seem gentle. You learn to hand over everything, to not even fantasize about keeping a penny for yourself. The workdays blend together into a grey, sooty blur. Monday morning you climb a chimney. Tuesday morning you climb a chimney. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you climb chimneys. The locations change. The specific architectural challenges change, but the fundamental horror remains constant. You are small, you are in the dark, you are in pain. You are terrified, and no one is coming to help you. You develop a climber's instincts over time. You learn to read chimneys from the bottom, judging width and angle and heat before you enter. You learn which types of brick have better grip, which mortars crumble when you press against them. You learn to navigate by feel in total darkness, using the echo of your breathing to judge space, using the temperature changes to know when you're approaching a bend. You learn to manage your fear, not overcome it, never that, but manage it. Compress it into something small enough that you can still function. You're always terrified, but you learn to be terrified efficiently, to let the fear fuel your climbing instead of freezing you. This is not courage. This is survival. Your dreams, when you sleep deeply enough to dream, are all of chimneys. You dream of being stuck forever, of climbing endlessly upward and never reaching the top, of falling down flues that have no bottom. You dream of fire chasing you up narrow passages, of brick walls closing in, until there's no space left at all. You wake gasping, covered in sweat despite the cold, your heart hammering, and for a moment you can't remember if you're in a chimney or the basement. Then the pain reminds you. You're always in pain, so you must still be alive. The seasons change, though you barely notice. Summer means hotter chimneys, more burns, but also dawn comes earlier, so you're not walking through dark streets as often. Winter means frozen fingers that won't grip brick properly, means ice on rooftops that sends boys sliding to their deaths, means the blessed relief of fewer daylight hours, so the workday ends sooner. Spring and autumn are indistinguishable, just variations of cold and damp and misery. You mark time not by months but by losses. William stops crying at night, which seems like progress until you realize he's stopped everything. Gone silent and empty in a way that's worse than crying. Thomas's cough gets worse until one morning, he doesn't wake up, just stops breathing sometime in the night, and Mr. Grimes drags his body out and buys a new boy named Frederick to replace him. Jack tries to steal bread from a market stall and gets caught, and you never see him again, probably transported or imprisoned or dead in some workhouse. New boys arrive, terrified and crying, and you watch them go through what you went through, and you feel nothing. You can't afford to feel. By the time you're 7, you're a veteran. You've survived 2 years of what kills most boys within one. You're still small, still malnourished, still covered in wounds that never heal, but you're alive, and in this trade, that's the only measure of success. You know every trick, every shortcut, every way to make the work marginally less horrible. You've learned which customers leave food scraps that can be stolen, which houses have dogs that bite, which neighborhoods have constables who might actually care if they see a master beating a boy too publicly. You've grown a little. Not much. Malnutrition has stunted you, but enough that some chimneys are becoming tighter. The narrowest flues, the ones you could navigate easily at 5, now require serious contortion. You can feel time running out, feel yourself growing toward uselessness. What happens to climbing boys who get too big varies. Some masters let them go, releasing them into a world they're unprepared for with no skills beyond climbing chimneys. Some keep them on as assistants, teaching them the business side, hoping to create new masters who will perpetuate the system. Some simply abandon them when they become unprofitable. Mr. Grimes hasn't indicated which path you're on, and you don't ask. Asking questions invites attention, and attention from Mr. Grimes is never good. The trade itself is changing slowly, glacially, in ways you won't understand for years. There are rumblings, distant and easy to ignore, about reform. Some members of Parliament, some social crusaders, some bleeding hearts who've never climbed a chimney in their lives, are making noise about child labour laws, about restrictions, about the possibility that maybe, possibly, this entire system is barbaric. The master sweeps, organised into their own guild and protective of their profits, push back hard. They argue that children are necessary, that adults can't fit, that mechanical solutions don't work, that the entire economy of chimney sweeping will collapse if they're forced to stop using climbing boys. They argue that they're providing a service to poor families, taking children who would otherwise starve and giving them a trade, a purpose, a future. They argue that climbing boys aren't really suffering, that children are resilient, that a little hard work never hurt anyone. These arguments are lies, but they're convenient lies, and Victorian society is built on convenient lies about class and poverty, and who deserves to suffer. So the arguments work, for a while, for years, for longer than they should. But there are witnesses now, people documenting what happens to climbing boys. Doctors who examine sweet boys and report their findings. Journalists who interview former climbers, who've survived long enough to tell their stories. Reformers who attend parliamentary sessions and read graphic descriptions of children suffocating in flues, being burned alive, dying of cancers that seem unique to this trade. Lord Shaftesbury, a name you don't know yet but will hear eventually, is leading the charge. He's a reformer, a moralist, a man who genuinely seems to believe that children shouldn't be destroyed for profit. He proposes bills, gives speeches, documents cases. He's opposed at every turn by practical men who talk about property rights and business concerns and the natural order of things. You know none of this. Your world is still chimneys and basements and Mr. Grimes's anger. But the world is shifting, slowly, in ways that will eventually matter. Around the time you turn 8, you start noticing the other climbing boys more carefully. Not Mr. Grimes's boys, but the ones you see across London, the small black figures on distant rooftops. You start to understand that you're not unique, that your suffering is replicated across the city in hundreds, maybe thousands of similar arrangements. Every master sweep has his boys. Every wealthy neighborhood has its climbing children. The system is vast. You see boys younger than you, 4 years old maybe, smaller, struggling with chimneys that make you struggle. You see boys older, 10 or 11, their bodies starting to broaden in ways that will end their usefulness. You see boys with limbs bent at wrong angles, from falls they survived but didn't recover from. You see boys coughing blood into their hands. You see boys who've given up, who go through the motions with dead eyes, already gone even though their bodies keep moving. Once, on a Sunday, you see a boy your age fall from a roof in Kensington. You're 3 streets away, begging outside a church, but you hear the commotion, the screams, the running feet. You don't go look. You know what you'd see. A small body on cobblestones, a crowd of well-dressed people forming a circle and staring. A master sweep shouting about his property loss, maybe a constable taking notes that will lead to nothing. You've seen this before. You'll see it again. The fall doesn't make news. Why would it? Climbing boys fall regularly, like rain or fog, or any other feature of London life. They're not important enough for newspapers, not individual enough to mourn. They're statistics, if anyone bothers counting, which mostly they don't. Your body continues its slow breakdown. Your lungs are compromised now, definitely. You wheeze constantly, a high-pitched sound that annoys Mr. Grimes. You cough up increasing amounts of black phlegm, sometimes streaked with blood. Your chest hurts when you breathe deeply, so you learn to breathe shallowly, taking small sips of air that don't satisfy but don't hurt as much. Your joints are damaged from the constant contortion and impact. Your knees crackle when you bend them. Your elbows have limited range of motion, unable to fully extend anymore. Your spine has compressed, possibly fractured in places, leaving you shorter than you should be, hunched in a way that's becoming permanent. Your skin is a disaster. The constant exposure to soot and creosote has created a condition doctors will later call chimney sweeps carcinoma. Though you won't live long enough to receive that diagnosis. You have rough, warty growths on your groin, your scrotum, places where skin folds and traps soot and sweat. They itch and burn and occasionally bleed. You have no privacy to examine them. No treatment even if you did. They're just another discomfort in a life defined by discomfort. Your teeth are rotting. Scurvy, malnutrition, and the constant soot exposure have left your gums swollen and bloody. Several teeth have fallen out. The ones remaining are brown and loose. Eating anything that requires chewing is difficult. But since you're mostly eating gruel and stale bread, it doesn't matter much. Your eyes are damaged too. The constant soot exposure has left them inflamed, producing thick discharge that crusts your lashes shut each morning. You have to pick the crust away before you can open them. Your vision, never great, is getting worse. You're developing cataracts. Though you don't know that word, just know that everything is getting hazier, harder to see. This doesn't affect your work much since you do most of it in total darkness anyway. You're 8 years old and your body is that of someone dying, which you are, just slowly. Mr. Grimes gets a new boy, a 5-year-old named Peter who cries constantly and won't climb. Mr. Grimes tries the usual methods, beatings, threats, lighting fires under him. Peter just screams louder. After 3 days, Mr. Grimes gives up and returns him to wherever he came from, getting maybe half his money back. This is unusual. Usually, boys break quickly or die. The ones who resist successfully are rare. You wonder sometimes what Peter had that you didn't, what reserve of strength or stubbornness or sheer luck let him refuse. You don't wonder long. Wondering about might have beens is dangerous, leads to hope, and hope is the thing that hurts most when it dies. Another boy arrives to replace Peter, this one 6 and more compliant. His name is Samuel, and he doesn't cry much, just stares with huge dark eyes, and does what he's told. You recognize the look. It's the look of someone who's already been broken by something else, for whom climbing chimneys is just a new variation of familiar suffering. You don't try to comfort him or explain things. He'll learn or he won't. Most don't. The work continues its relentless rhythm. You climb, you bleed, you breathe soot, you sleep badly, you wake and climb again. Days blur into weeks, blur into months, blur into a continuous present tense of survival. You stop thinking about the future, because the future is just more of this until it kills you. You stop thinking about the past, because the past is gone and remembering it hurts. You exist in an eternal now of chimneys and pain. But the world above you, the world of parliament and reformers and public opinion, is starting to shift in ways that will eventually trickle down even to you. The Climbing Boys Act of 1840, passed years before you were born, was supposed to end this. It made it illegal to force children under 16 up chimneys. It was widely ignored. The law had no enforcement mechanism, no penalties that mattered, no way to distinguish between a boy who climbed willingly, if such a thing exists, and one who climbed under threat of violence. Master sweeps continued operating as they always had, and magistrates looked the other way. But pressure is building. The reformers are getting louder, more organized, more effective at turning individual tragedies into public scandals. Lord Shaftesbury continues his crusade, allied now with other members of the aristocracy, who've decided that child welfare is worth fighting for. They're opposed by entrenched interests, by the Master Sweeps Guild, by property owners who don't want to pay higher costs for chimney cleaning, by MPs who represent districts where the sweeping trade employs dozens of men who vote. It's a political battle playing out in spaces you'll never see, using language you wouldn't understand, concerning your body and your labor and your life without ever consulting you about any of it. In 1851, there's another attempt at legislation. The Act for the Better Regulation of Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys tries to close the loopholes in earlier laws. It raises the age limit, increases penalties for masters who use undersized boys, requires police to actually enforce the regulations. It passes, and then, like previous laws, it's mostly ignored. The fines are small enough that masters factor them into business costs. The police are understaffed and uninterested. The social will to actually stop the trade doesn't exist yet. You're 10 now, growing toward the end of your usefulness. Your shoulders are broadening despite malnutrition. Your hips are widening. The tightest chimneys are becoming impossible, and the possible ones are becoming dangerous, requiring you to compress your body in ways that leave you stuck more often, extracted with more difficulty. Mr. Grimes is starting to look at you differently, calculating. You represent an investment that's nearing its expiration date. Soon you'll be too big to climb, and then what? He could try to teach you the business, make you an assistant. Eventually a master sweep with your own crew of boys. Some former climbing boys follow this path, becoming the very thing that destroyed them, perpetuating the cycle. Or he could just let you go, release you into London with no skills, no money, no prospects. You'd probably die. Starvation or disease or violence, within months. Or you'd survive somehow, joining the masses of urban poor, doing whatever they can to stay alive, begging, stealing, selling whatever they have to sell. Mr. Grimes hasn't decided yet, and you have no say in the matter. Your future is determined by his economic calculation, by whether he thinks you're worth the effort of retaining. Before he can decide, your body decides for you. You're climbing a chimney in Chelsea, a narrow one, tighter than usual but not impossible. You've done this 100 times, 1,000 times. You know what you're doing. You wedge yourself in, brace your back against one wall, your feet against the other, and push upward. Something tears. It's in your groin, a sharp, hot pain that's different from the usual climbing pain, more immediate, more wrong. You gasp and stop moving, trying to assess what happened. The pain intensifies, spreading through your lower abdomen. You try to move and can't. Not because you're stuck in the chimney, but because your body won't respond correctly. You've given yourself a hernia, a rupture in your abdominal wall from the constant straining and contortion. It's common among climbing boys, almost inevitable. Your muscles, never properly developed due to malnutrition, weakened further by injury and overuse, have finally failed. You manage to work your way back down the chimney, moving carefully, each motion sending fresh waves of pain through your core. When you emerge at the bottom, you're pale under the suit, sweating, your breathing rapid and shallow. Mr. Grimes takes one look and knows what's happened. He's seen it before. He curses, not at you exactly, but at the situation, at the loss of his investment. You're done. Can't climb with a hernia. Can't do anything much. You've become useless. He takes you back to the basement and leaves you there. No doctor, no treatment, just a dismissal. You lie on your sack and try not to move because moving hurts. The other boys, Samuel and a new one named Edward, look at you with expressions that might be sympathy, but are more likely just recognition. This is what awaits all of them eventually: injury, dismissal, an uncertain fate. You spend 3 days in the basement, barely moving, eating the scraps the other boys sneak to you when Mr. Grimes isn't looking. The hernia doesn't heal, because hernias don't, not without surgery. And surgery costs money you don't have and requires doctors who don't treat climbing boys anyway. On the 4th day, Mr. Grimes tells you to get out. Just like that. No ceremony, no final payment, no gratitude for 5 years of labor. You've ceased to be profitable. So you cease to exist as far as he's concerned. He keeps your Sunday begging money, keeps everything, and sends you into the street with nothing but the rags you're wearing and a body so damaged it's barely functional. You're 10 years old, ruptured, malnourished, illiterate, and homeless in London. Your prospects are not good. You wander for a while, not sure where to go or what to do. You head vaguely towards 7 Dials, toward the rookery where you were born. But when you get there, you can't find your family's old room. Or maybe it's been occupied by someone else. Or maybe your family moved or died, and no one knows or cares where they went. You ask a few people if they remember a family with your surname, but no one does. Or they do but won't tell you. Or you're asking the wrong people. It doesn't matter. That life is gone. You sleep in doorways, under bridges, in the spaces between buildings that London's architecture creates. You're not alone. There are thousands of homeless children in Victorian London, maybe tens of thousands, all competing for the same scraps, the same shelter, the same slim chances at survival. You try begging, but you're competing with more experienced beggars, and your injuries make you slow, unable to chase down potential marks or flee when shopkeepers chase you off. You make a few pennies, enough for stale bread once or twice, but not enough to live on. You try stealing, but you're not good at it, never learn the skills, and the first time you attempt to lift a gentleman's handkerchief, you get caught. The gentleman doesn't call the police, just shoves you hard enough that you fall, aggravating your hernia, sending you gasping to the cobblestones. You learn that stealing requires abilities you don't have. You're starving now, actually starving. Not the chronic malnutrition of your climbing years, but acute hunger, the kind that makes your vision sparkle and your thoughts slow. You eat things you find in gutters, things you can't identify, rotting vegetables, something that might have been meat once. You get sick, violently sick, vomiting and shitting simultaneously in an alley, your body expelling everything while having nothing to expel. You think you might die, and you're not particularly upset about it. Death would at least be an ending, a conclusion to suffering that seems otherwise infinite. You lie in the alley and wait for whatever comes next. What comes next is a woman. She's not young, not old, maybe 30, maybe 50, hard to tell. She's not wealthy, but not street poor either. Wearing a clean dress and practical boots, and an expression that's seen too much to be shocked by a dying child in an alley. She leans over you and asks if you can walk. You try to answer, but your voice doesn't work, so you just nod, though you're not sure if it's true. She helps you up, supporting your weight, and leads you through streets to a building with a sign you can't read. Inside, there are beds, clean beds with actual blankets, and the smell is wrong for London, too clean, like soap and medicine, instead of rot and smoke. You've stumbled into one of the ragged schools, the charitable institutions that are starting to appear across London, trying to catch the poorest children, the ones falling through every other crack, and give them something, anything, education, food, basic healthcare, a chance. The woman, a teacher or volunteer or missionary, you're never quite sure, puts you in a bed and brings you soup. Actual soup with vegetables and possibly meat, hot and impossible. You eat slowly because your stomach has shrunk and can't handle much at once. You sleep for what feels like days. When you wake, properly wake, a man is examining you. He's a doctor, making his rounds of the charity cases, and he's looking at your hernia, your lungs, your skin, your everything with an expression that cycles between clinical interest and barely contained horror. He asks you questions. How old are you? Where are your parents? What work have you done? You answer as best you can, your voice rusty from disuse. When you tell him you were a climbing boy, his expression shifts to something like recognition. He's seen this before, or heard about it, or treated other boys like you. He knows what you represent. He can't fix the hernia without surgery, and surgery isn't available to charity cases, but he wraps your abdomen tightly. Creates a kind of support that makes movement less agonizing. He listens to your lungs and shakes his head. He examines the growths on your skin and makes notes in a journal. He's documenting you, turning your suffering into data that will hopefully, eventually, convince someone to care. The ragged school keeps you. Not forever, they don't have resources for that, but for a few weeks, maybe a month. You eat regularly for the first time in your life. Plain food but consistent. You start to put on a little weight, though not much. Your body is too damaged to recover properly. You're taught letters, basic reading, though your eyes are too bad and your attention too fractured for much to stick. Mostly you rest. You sleep in a real bed. You're not beaten. You're not forced up chimneys. For the first time since you were 5, your life is not defined by immediate, constant suffering. It's still hard, still painful, still hopeless. But the intensity has decreased from unbearable to merely bad. The ragged school is run by religious people. Evangelical Christians who believe in saving souls, and that saving bodies is the first step. They pray over you, teach you hymns, talk about Jesus and redemption and God's plan. You're not sure you believe any of it, but you're polite, grateful enough to play along. If they want to think they're saving your soul while they feed your body, that's fine. You meet other boys here, other former climbing boys, other child labourers from various industries. There are mill boys with mangled hands from machinery. There are mine boys with lungs as bad as yours. There are mudlarks who scavenged the Thames shores and have infections from constantly being in filthy water. You're all damaged goods. All children that industrial Victorian England has chewed up and isn't quite ready to discard yet. The stories you hear are remarkably similar. Poverty, sale or indenture, brutal labour, injury, dismissal, near death, and then by luck or charity or accident ending up here. The system is consistent in its cruelty, varied only in the specific ways it destroys children. One boy, a former mill worker named Henry, tells you about Lord Shaftesbury's visits to factories, about the investigations and reports and parliamentary debates. He says things are changing. Slowly, that there are laws now protecting children, that the factories can't work them as hard or as young. He's optimistic in a way you can't quite manage, still believing that someone cares, that the world is improving. You want to believe him, but your experience suggests otherwise. Laws get passed and ignored. Reformers give speeches while children die. The system adapts and continues. You've seen no evidence that anyone with actual power cares enough to stop what's happening. But things are changing, whether you believe it or not. The pressure has been building for years, and it's finally reaching critical mass. In 1864, another Act of Parliament is passed. This one with more teeth than previous attempts. The Act for the Regulation of Chimney Sweepers specifically targets the use of climbing boys, raising the age limit, increasing penalties, requiring police enforcement. More importantly, it gives magistrates the power to prosecute, not just masters but also property owners who allow the practice. This matters because property owners have money and influence, and the threat of prosecuting them creates incentive to comply. Master sweeps can be fined or imprisoned and continue operating. Wealthy homeowners can be publicly shamed in courts, their names in newspapers, their reputations damaged. That threat works where previous threats didn't. The Act also requires mechanical sweeping devices to be used where possible, legitimizing the technology that's been gradually improving. Brushes on long rods, cane scrapers, devices that can clean most chimneys without requiring a child to climb. They're not perfect, and some very narrow or complicated flues still resist mechanical cleaning, but they work well enough for most purposes. The master sweeps fight back. Of course, they petition Parliament, they lobby MPs. They publish testimonials claiming their boys are happy and well treated, and that mechanical devices don't work, and that the entire economy of chimney sweeping will collapse, and also, probably, civilization will end, if they're not allowed to continue their trade as they've always practiced it. But the tide has turned. The reformers have been documenting cases for decades, and the accumulated evidence is overwhelming. Parliamentary reports describe boys suffocating in flues, dying of cancer, being crippled by falls and burns. Doctors testify about the health effects, the lung damage, the skin conditions, the developmental problems. Former climbing boys, the few who survived long enough to tell their stories, give testimony that's heartbreaking and specific. The public is starting to care, or at least starting to be uncomfortable enough that ignoring the issue becomes harder. Newspapers run stories about climbing boys. Novels feature them as tragic figures. The middle class, growing larger and more influential, develops a conscience, or at least a fashionable concern, for the suffering of picturesque poor children. It's not universal. Plenty of people still argue for the status quo, still claim that poor children need to work, that hardship builds character, that interfering with how parents dispose of their children is government overreach. But they're losing ground. The 1864 Act doesn't end the practice immediately. Laws take time to implement, and cultural practices take even longer to change. Master sweeps continue using climbing boys for years after the Act passes, paying the occasional fine, moving operations to areas where enforcement is lax, adapting rather than complying, but the numbers start declining. Fewer new boys are inducted into the trade. More masters switch to mechanical methods, grudgingly admitting they work well enough. Property owners, threatened with prosecution and unwilling to risk their reputations, refuse to allow climbing boys on their premises. The economic model that sustained the trade begins to collapse. By 1875, climbing boys are rare in London, though still present in smaller cities and rural areas. By 1880, they're almost extinct. The practice continues in isolated pockets for years more. But it's no longer widespread, no longer the default method of chimney cleaning. You don't witness most of this transformation. After your time in the ragged school, you're placed in a workhouse, one of the large institutional facilities that Victorian England uses to warehouse its inconvenient poor. The workhouse is not pleasant. It's a prison in all but name, with harsh rules and tedious labour, and an atmosphere of punitive control. But it's not climbing chimneys. You work in the workhouse picking oakum, unravelling old rope into fibres that can be reused. Your damaged hands struggling with the task, but managing it. You're fed barely and housed barely, and that's enough. Your hernia never heals. Your lungs continue their slow deterioration. Your skin conditions spread slowly. You're not going to live a long life. Your body has been too damaged for that. But you might make it to 20, maybe 25 if you're lucky. You never learn what happened to the other boys you knew. Samuel and Edward probably continued climbing until they got too big or too injured or too dead. Mr. Grimes probably continued operating until the law made it unprofitable, then switched to mechanical methods, or retired or died. The system that destroyed you moved on, found new victims or new methods, adapted and persisted. You think about climbing sometimes, even though you don't want to. You have nightmares where you're back in the flues, stuck in the dark, unable to move, suffocating. You wake gasping and have to remind yourself you're not there anymore. That part of your life is over. You hear, through the gossip that circulates in workhouses, about reforms and laws and changing attitudes. You hear that climbing boys are becoming rare, that the trade is dying. You're glad, in an abstract way, that other children might not suffer what you suffered, but you're also aware that your suffering enabled this change. The reformers needed cases to document, tragedies to publicize, bodies to point at. You were one of those bodies, one of thousands, and your pain was the currency that bought future children's safety. There's no compensation for this, no recognition, no apology. You're not a hero or a martyr or a symbol. You're just someone who survived, barely, a system designed to be unsurvivable. The fact that the system is changing doesn't change what it did to you. Lord Shaftesbury, the reformer who led the fight against climbing boys, never meets you. He never meets any of the actual children whose lives his legislation affected. He works in Parliament, in drawing rooms, in spaces where the poor are discussed but not present. His motivations are genuine, his commitment real, but there's an unbridgeable gap between reformers and the reformed, between the people who change laws and the people who live under those laws. The Climbing Boys Acts, the series of laws passed between 1840 and 1875, are considered successes. They're cited as evidence that reform works, that persistent advocacy can overcome entrenched interests, that society can recognize its own cruelty and correct course. All of this is true, sort of. What's less discussed is how long it took, how many children died or were crippled while reformers debated and legislators compromised and enforcement remained lax. What's less discussed is how the trade adapted, moving to areas with less oversight, targeting even younger children who could fit tinier spaces, intensifying the exploitation, even as it declined in scale. What's less discussed is what happened to all the former climbing boys, the ones who survived their indentures, but were released into adulthood with no skills, no health, no prospects. The laws ended their work but didn't create alternatives, didn't provide rehabilitation, didn't acknowledge that children who spent their formative years being traumatized and damaged might need something more than just being told they're free now. You age in the workhouse, your body breaking down faster than it should. By 15, you look 30, hunched and wheezing, and moving like an old man. By 18, you're coughing blood daily, your lungs finally giving up after years of abuse. You know you're dying, can feel it in the way your body is shutting down piece by piece. The workhouse doesn't provide medical care beyond the most basic, and what you need is far beyond basic. You need surgery for the hernia, treatment for the lung disease, removal of the cancerous growths, care that requires expertise and resources that aren't available to paupers. You get none of it. You die on a Tuesday in March, you're not sure what year exactly, maybe 1868, maybe later. You die in a workhouse bed, surrounded by other dying people, attended by no one who knows your name or cares about your story. You die young, never having experienced most of what life offers, never having been healthy or safe or free of pain. Your death is not recorded in any meaningful way. The workhouse notes it in their registers, a line item, male pauper, approximate age 20, cause of death respiratory failure. There's no funeral, no grave marker. Just burial in a common pit with other unclaimed dead. Your body mixed with strangers, returned to the earth without ceremony. You're one of thousands of climbing boys who died young, who were destroyed by a trade that prioritized clean chimneys over human life, who suffered so that wealthy Victorians could have efficient heating and clean air. Your individual story doesn't matter to history, doesn't appear in textbooks or museums or commemorations, but collectively, you and the boys like you mattered. Your suffering, documented by reformers and doctors and journalists, created the evidence base that made the practice indefensible. Your bodies, damaged and broken and dead, were the proof that something had to change. The end of climbing boys wasn't inevitable. It required specific people making specific choices, advocating, documenting, legislating, enforcing. It required Lord Shaftesbury's stubborn persistence. The doctors who examined sweep boys and reported honestly about what they found. The journalists who wrote about the trade's horrors. The MPs who voted for reform despite pressure from business interests. But it also required you, and the thousands of boys like you, to exist, to suffer, to die, to be visible enough that ignoring you became impossible. You were the evidence. Your broken body, your destroyed lungs, your abbreviated life. These were the things that couldn't be explained away or justified or dismissed. The Victorian era loved its narratives of progress, of industrial advancement, of empire and achievement. It was less comfortable with the costs of that progress, with the children ground up in machinery, worked to death in mills, sent into mines and chimneys, and situations no human should endure. The climbing boys represented an uncomfortable truth about what industrial capitalism required, about who paid the price for other people's comfort. Your story, the story of being born poor, sold into brutal labor, destroyed systematically, then discarded, is not unique to climbing boys. It's the pattern repeated across Victorian child labor, across industries and trades, and the entire economic system. The specific details vary. The mine boys had cave-ins instead of chimney falls. The mill boys had machines that took fingers instead of flues that scraped skin. But the fundamental dynamic was identical. Children were cheap, disposable labor. Their small size was useful. Their limited ability to advocate for themselves was convenient. Their suffering was profitable. And Victorian society, despite its Christian morality and its philosophical sophistication and its cultural achievements, was willing to accept this arrangement for decades before finally, grudgingly, admitting it was wrong. The reform of climbing boys is often presented as a triumph, a story of good defeating evil, of conscience overcoming greed. And there's truth in that narrative. The reformers were genuinely trying to help. The laws they passed did eventually end the practice. The children who came after you did not have to climb chimneys. But it's also a story of how slowly change happens, how much suffering it takes to move institutions, how reform requires not just good intentions, but specific mechanisms of enforcement and cultural will to sustain them. The first law against climbing boys passed in 1840. The practice didn't effectively end until the 1870s. That's 30 years of continued suffering. 30 years of boys climbing chimneys, while society debated whether they should. 30 years of profit taking precedence over human welfare. And it's a story of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. Lord Shaftesbury has statues and streets named after him. The doctors and journalists who documented the trade's horrors are footnotes in history books. But you, and Thomas, and William, and Jack, and Samuel, and Edward, and the thousands of other climbing boys, you're anonymous. Your names aren't recorded. Your suffering is noted in aggregate. Your statistics, examples, cautionary tales, but not individuals with stories that matter. This erasure is part of the crime. You lived, you suffered, you mattered, you had thoughts and fears and dreams that were real even if they're lost now. Reducing you to a symbol or a data point or a tragic case study misses the fundamental humanity that was violated when you were forced up chimneys as a child. If we're honest about Victorian reform, we have to acknowledge both its achievements and its limitations. Yes, climbing boys eventually stopped being used. Yes, laws were passed and enforced. Yes, children's welfare improved incrementally, gradually, never enough but more than before. But we also have to acknowledge how partial that progress was, how inadequate the response, how many children it failed to save. We have to acknowledge that the trade existed for nearly a century after people knew it was harmful, that economic interests delayed reform decade after decade, that the suffering of poor children was considered an acceptable cost of business. The mechanical sweeping devices that eventually replaced climbing boys existed for years before they were widely adopted. The technology wasn't the barrier. The barrier was that using children was cheaper, more convenient, more aligned with existing business practices. Master sweeps resisted change, not because it was impossible, but because it was unprofitable. Property owners resisted change, not because alternatives didn't work, but because alternatives cost more. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the climbing boys' story. The suffering was unnecessary. It could have been prevented at any point with existing technology and resources. It continued because stopping it required people with power to accept inconvenience and cost. And they weren't willing to do that until public pressure made the alternative more costly than compliance. Your life, and the lives of thousands of boys like you, were traded for that convenience. Your childhoods were sacrificed so that wealthy Londoners could have clean chimneys without paying higher rates. Your bodies were destroyed so that master sweeps could maintain their profit margins. Your deaths were accepted as normal, unfortunate but inevitable. Just the cost of doing business. The reformers who eventually changed this system deserve credit for their persistence, their moral clarity, their willingness to fight entrenched interests. But they also worked within frameworks that accepted fundamental inequalities, that took for granted that poor children would work, that questioned only the most extreme forms of exploitation while leaving the basic economic arrangements unchallenged. Lord Shaftesbury didn't advocate for ending child labour entirely, just regulating its worst excesses. The Climbing Boys Acts didn't provide for the boys, who were displaced when the trade ended, didn't create systems to rehabilitate or educate or employ them. The reform was narrow, focused on stopping one specific practice, without addressing the poverty and powerlessness that made that practice possible. So what happened after Climbing Boys ended? The poorest children, the ones who would have been sold to master sweeps, didn't suddenly have better lives. They worked in other trades, other dangerous occupations, other situations that exploited their small size and limited ability to resist. The economic forces that created climbing boys didn't disappear. They just found new outlets. Some former climbing boys, the ones healthy enough and lucky enough, found legitimate work. They became labourers, dock workers, soldiers, whatever they could manage with their damaged bodies and limited skills. Some ended up in workhouses, like you, warehoused and forgotten. Some became criminals, turning to theft or prostitution, or whatever survival strategies were available. Many died young from the accumulated damage of their climbing years. There was no systematic effort to help former climbing boys transition to other lives. No compensation, no education programs, no acknowledgement that society owed them anything for the years of suffering inflicted. They were released from their indentures and expected to figure things out on their own. Children barely into their teens, trying to navigate an unforgiving world with broken bodies and no support. The master sweeps, meanwhile, adapted. Those who could afford mechanical equipment purchased it and continued in business, employing adult sweeps who operated from outside the chimneys. Those who couldn't afford equipment went out of business or moved to areas where enforcement was lax and continued using children illegally for years. The guild structure that had protected the trade weakened, but didn't disappear, transforming into associations of legitimate sweeps who advocated for their profession while carefully distancing themselves from their history. Some former masters became advocates for reform, repositioning themselves as having always been against the use of climbing boys, claiming they'd only participated under economic duress. These revisionist narratives were accepted, mostly because Victorian society preferred redemption stories to accountability. It was easier to believe that everyone had good intentions than to prosecute the men who had systematically abused children for profit. Mr. Grimes, your particular tormentor, probably followed one of these paths. Maybe he went legitimate, bought mechanical equipment, hired adult assistants. Maybe he went out of business and found other work, Maybe he continued using boys illegally until enforcement caught up with him. You never found out. His fate, like the fates of most masters, wasn't recorded in ways that history preserved. The houses where you climbed, the wealthy homes in Bloomsbury and Mayfair and Belgravia, continued their comfortable existences. The families who lived there, who benefited from your labor, who watched you emerge from their chimneys, covered in blood and soot. They experienced no consequences for their participation in the system. They paid their fees to Mr. Grimes, maintained their properties, and when the laws changed, they simply hired different sweeps who used different methods. There was no reckoning, no moment where property owners had to confront their complicity, no public accounting of who employed climbing boys and why. The practice ended, and everyone pretended it had been an unfortunate necessity, a regrettable but understandable feature of a less enlightened time, rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize comfort over children's lives. This is how most social progress works, unfortunately. The system changes, slowly and incompletely, and then everyone involved rewrites their participation, minimizes their responsibility, claims they always knew it was wrong and were just waiting for the right moment to act. The victims are forgotten, the perpetrators are forgiven or ignored, and the comfortable classes congratulate themselves for being more moral than their predecessors while participating in new versions of the same dynamics. In your time, while you were climbing chimneys, other children were working in mines, in mills, in agricultural labor, in domestic service, in prostitution, in countless situations that destroyed them in different ways. The reform of climbing boys didn't fix those situations, didn't even necessarily help the children, who would have been climbing boys, find better alternatives. It just eliminated one specific form of exploitation, while leaving the underlying systems intact. Victorian child labour reform was incremental and incomplete. Each industry had to be addressed separately, fought over separately, reformed separately. The Factory Acts regulated textile mills. The Mines Act regulated coal mining. The Climbing Boys Acts regulated chimney sweeping. Each reform was hard-won, opposed by business interests, compromised in implementation, and limited in scope. It took decades, generations, for child labour to become genuinely unacceptable in Britain. Even after climbing boys ended, children continued working in dangerous situations well into the 20th century. The change was real but painfully slow, and thousands of children died or were crippled while society gradually decided their welfare mattered. The question that haunts this history is why it took so long. Why, once the harm was documented, once doctors and reformers and journalists had clearly established that climbing boys were being destroyed, why did society allow it to continue for decades more? Part of the answer is economic. The people who profited from child labour had resources and influence. They could lobby Parliament, shape public opinion, delay and dilute reforms. They could frame the issue as about property rights or business freedom rather than child welfare. They could threaten economic consequences if forced to change, unemployment and business failures and social disruption. Part of the answer is ideological. Victorian society believed in limited government, in minimal interference with private economic arrangements. The idea that the state should regulate how businesses operated, how parents disposed of their children, how contracts were structured, was genuinely controversial. Many people who acknowledged that climbing boys suffered still opposed legal intervention as overreach. Part of the answer is class-based. The children who climbed chimneys came from the lowest classes, from families with no political power, no social standing, no ability to advocate for themselves. Their suffering was easy to ignore because they were easy to ignore, poor and dirty and other. Not the kind of children that wealthy Victorians encountered in their daily lives, except as servants or problems. And part of the answer is simply moral failure. People knew what was happening and chose not to care enough to stop it. They prioritized their own comfort, their own economic interests, their own convenience over the lives of children they didn't know and didn't want to think about. This is perhaps the most damning aspect. Not ignorance or misunderstanding, but active choice to allow harm, when stopping it would have required personal cost. The doctors who examined climbing boys and wrote reports didn't climb chimneys themselves. The reformers who gave speeches didn't send their own children up flues. The property owners who employed master sweeps didn't breathe soot or develop cancers. The suffering was always elsewhere, experienced by other people's children, which made it easier to acknowledge abstractly while doing nothing concrete. This distancing is visible in the language used to discuss climbing boys during the reform debates. They were rarely called children, instead described as juveniles, or apprentices, or boys, terms that created emotional distance. Their suffering was described in clinical language, injurious to health, or inconsistent with proper development, rather than the more accurate torture or systematic abuse. The reformers themselves, well-intentioned as they were, participated in this distancing. Lord Shaftesbury spoke movingly about climbing boys, but never spent time with actual sweep children, never visited them in their basement lodgings, never witnessed their daily reality. His advocacy was based on reports and statistics and second-hand accounts. Legitimate sources, but filtered through layers of bureaucracy and class difference. This isn't to diminish his work or that of other reformers. They achieved real change despite opposition and obstacles. But it's important to recognize that reform happened in spaces far removed from actual suffering, debated by people who never experienced what they were discussing, implemented through systems that prioritized order and gradual change over immediate relief. If a group of climbing boys had stormed Parliament and demanded change, they would have been arrested or dismissed as a mob. Reform had to come from within the system, from people the system respected, using methods the system accepted. This meant change happened on the system's timeline, which was slow, and according to the system's priorities, which weren't always aligned with victims' needs. The climbing boys themselves had no voice in the reform process. No former climbing boy testified before Parliament. No sweep children were consulted about what changes they needed. Their experiences were reported by others, interpreted by others, used by others to advance arguments they might not have made themselves. This is common in social reform. The people most affected by injustice are often least able to participate in addressing it, while people with privilege and power speak on their behalf, sometimes accurately, sometimes projecting their own assumptions and priorities onto situations they don't fully understand. What would climbing boys have asked for if they'd had the chance? Maybe immediate rescue from their current situations, rather than gradual reform. Maybe prosecution of masters who abused them. Maybe compensation for their suffering. Maybe job training and education, so they could transition to other work. Maybe just acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong, and that they deserved better. They got none of these things. Just the eventual ending of the practice that was destroying them, implemented gradually, without support systems, leaving them to manage the transition on their own. Your death in the workhouse, alone and young and unmourned, is the real ending of your story, not the legislative victories, or the gradual decline of climbing boys, or the self-congratulatory narratives about Victorian moral progress. You suffered, and then you died, and nothing that happened afterward changed those facts. But your suffering, combined with thousands of others, did eventually create change. The documented cases of climbing boys, their injuries and deaths and abbreviated lives, became impossible to ignore. The accumulation of evidence, year after year, report after report, wore down the opposition's arguments until defending the practice became indefensible. This is cold comfort, that your pain had utility, that your destroyed body served as evidence in someone else's campaign. You didn't choose martyrdom, didn't volunteer to suffer for future generations' benefit. You were just trying to survive, day by day, chimney by chimney. And the fact that your survival attempt failed in ways that helped create change doesn't make your experience meaningful, or worthwhile. The climbing boys who came after you, the ones who didn't have to climb because laws eventually had teeth, they don't know your name, don't know your story, don't know that their freedom from chimneys was purchased partly with your suffering. That's probably appropriate. Gratitude to dead victims is a strange concept, and the debt is owed not to you but to all children. A responsibility to ensure that what happened to you never happens again. Has that responsibility been met? Victorian child labour eventually ended in Britain through decades of incremental reform and changing economic conditions and cultural evolution. Children now have legal protections, mandatory education, restrictions on work hours and conditions, rights that seemed impossible in your time. But exploitation of children hasn't ended globally, just moved. The same economic forces that created climbing boys, the drive for cheap labour, the utility of small bodies, the vulnerability of the powerless, these still exist. They create child labour in mines, in factories, in agriculture, in domestic service, in brothels, across the developing world. The wealthy nations that reformed their own child labour practices now consume products made by children in countries where reform hasn't happened or isn't enforced. The exploitation is outsourced, made invisible, allowed to continue, because stopping it would require the same kinds of sacrifices that Victorian property owners eventually accepted: higher costs and less convenience, and acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Your story, the story of climbing boys, is not just historical, it's a template, a pattern that repeats whenever economic systems prioritize efficiency over human welfare, whenever those with power decide that other people's children are acceptable sacrifices, whenever society knows harm is happening and chooses to let it continue. The specific details change. The chimneys are now garment factories, or cobalt mines, or shrimp boats. The master sweeps are now supply chain managers, or subcontractors, or criminal networks. The wealthy customers are now corporations or consumers, or all of us purchasing products without thinking about where they came from. But the fundamental dynamic, cheap vulnerable labour being destroyed for profit, remains. The lesson of climbing boys, if there is one, is that reform is possible but requires more than good intentions. It requires documentation that can't be ignored, advocacy that won't give up, legal frameworks that actually have teeth, enforcement that's consistent, and social will that's sustained long enough to overcome entrenched opposition. It also requires acknowledging that the victims of exploitation pay costs that reform can't undo, that ending a harmful practice doesn't heal the people already harmed, that justice delayed is justice denied, even when it eventually arrives. You were 5 when you entered your first chimney, 10 when you left your last, 20 when you died. 15 years of life, most of them suffering, none of them fair, none of them what childhood should be. The world that destroyed you eventually changed, slowly, partially, incompletely. That change matters, but it doesn't resurrect you, doesn't undo your pain, doesn't make your story any less tragic. If there's meaning in your suffering, it's not the meaning reformers assigned, not a necessary sacrifice for progress or a cautionary tale that improved society. The meaning, if any, is in the simple fact that you were human, that you mattered, that what was done to you was wrong, regardless of its eventual consequences. You deserved better. All the climbing boys deserved better. The children working in dangerous conditions now deserve better. Deserving better and getting better are different things. A gap that persists across centuries and continues into the present. Your story ends in an unmarked grave, your body returned to earth without ceremony, your name lost to history. But the fact that you're forgotten doesn't mean you didn't exist, didn't suffer, didn't matter. You were real. Your pain was real. Your abbreviated life contained experiences and thoughts and feelings that were as valid as anyone's, even if they're lost now. The chimneys you climbed are still standing, many of them, in London's old neighbourhoods. They're cleaned by adults now, with mechanical equipment, safely and without destroying anyone. The houses are worth fortunes, owned by people who have no idea that children once climbed their flues, who wouldn't believe the stories if told them. The basement where Mr. Grimes kept you, if it still exists, is probably renovated now, converted to modern use, the soot scrubbed away, the history erased. The streets you walked, following Mr. Grimes through pre-dawn darkness, are still there but transformed, cleaner, brighter, populated by people living lives you couldn't have imagined. London changed. Britain changed. The world changed. The specific horrors you experienced are mostly gone, replaced by new horrors and genuine progress in complicated combination. Your suffering contributed to that change, unwillingly, but it did. The evidence of what climbing boys endured helped make the practice indefensible, helped push reform forward, helped protect future children. But you're still dead at 20, and nothing changes that. And maybe that's the most honest ending available. Not redemption or meaning or progress. Just the plain fact of a young life, destroyed by systems that could have been different, should have been different, but weren't, not in time to save you. You were born into soot, you lived in soot, you died too young, and your story is over. But the pattern your story represents, the exploitation of the vulnerable for the convenience of the powerful, that story continues. It requires constant vigilance, constant advocacy, constant willingness to prioritize human welfare over economic efficiency, constant recognition that other people's children matter as much as our own. The climbing boys are gone. The lessons they should have taught us remain relevant. Every child who suffers now, because stopping that suffering would be inconvenient or expensive or require systemic change, is a reminder that we still haven't fully learned those lessons. That the distance between knowing something is wrong and actually stopping it remains vast. Your life mattered. Your suffering mattered. Your death mattered. Not because they served some larger purpose, but because you were human and deserved better and didn't get it. That's the tragedy. Plain and uncomforted and true. And that's where your story, the brutal life of a child chimney sweep in Victorian England, has to end.